The Mont Pelerin Society, the secret architects of our modern world. We think we know how the modern world was built. We think of it as a story of elections, of wars, of technological revolutions. A story that happens in the open, on the floor of parliaments and on the screens of our televisions. But what if the blueprint for our world, the very economic and political reality we inhabit today, was drawn up in secret? What if it was conceived not in a public forum, but in a quiet hotel, perched on a Swiss mountain, by a small, dedicated group of intellectuals who believed they were fighting a lonely war for the soul of civilization? They were not a secret society in the traditional sense. They had no blood oaths, no arcane rituals. Their weapons were not daggers, but ideas. Yet, their society was exclusive, their meetings were private, and their long-term strategy was to patiently and methodically change the world from the shadows, by capturing the minds of the future. They called themselves the Mont Pelerin Society. And in their quiet, decades-long revolution, they would move from the fringes of respectable. To understand a revolution, you must first understand the world it sought to overthrow. To comprehend the origins of the society that would redraw the economic map of the globe, we cannot begin on a tranquil Swiss mountain. Our story must begin in the ashes of a world that had been consumed by two successive world-shattering catastrophes, the Great Depression and the Second World War. These two events, intertwined and inseparable, did more than just destroy cities and claim the lives of tens of millions. They destroyed an idea. They shattered an entire worldview, a faith that had dominated Western civilization for more than a century. That faith was a belief in the inherent virtue and self-regulating genius of the free market. For 100 years, since the time of Adam Smith, the prevailing orthodoxy had been laissez-faire. The belief that an invisible hand, the collective, self-interested actions of individuals pursuing their own gain, would magically produce the greatest possible prosperity for all. The role of government in this view was simple: to get out of the way. It was to enforce contracts, protect private property, and then leave the market to its own elegant, efficient devices. In the heady days of the 1920s, this faith seemed to be vindicated. But it was a faith built on a bubble of speculation and credit. And in the autumn of 1929, that bubble burst with a terrifying finality. The Wall Street crash triggered a global economic collapse of unprecedented scale. Banks failed by the thousand. Factories fell silent. Fortunes built over generations were wiped out in an afternoon. And most devastatingly, a quarter of the workforce in the industrialized world found themselves without a job, without an income, without hope. The Great Depression was more than an economic crisis. It was a profound crisis of faith in the capitalist system itself. The invisible hand, it seemed, had not led to universal prosperity, but to universal misery. The system had failed spectacularly and catastrophically. This economic collapse created a fertile ground for political extremism. Across Europe, people lost faith in liberal democracy, which seemed helpless in the face of the crisis. They turned to new, radical ideologies that promised salvation through the power of a strong centralized state. In Italy, it was the fascism of Mussolini. In the Soviet Union, it was the communism of Stalin. And in Germany, the economic desperation of the German people provided the fertile soil in which Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party could grow. Their rise to power fueled by the promise of restoring order and national pride. Many would come to believe that the Second World War, the most destructive conflict in human history, was a direct and inevitable consequence of the failure of laissez-faire capitalism. As the world began to pick itself up from the rubble of the war, a new and powerful consensus was being forged. The leaders who gathered to rebuild the world were united by a single, shared conviction: never again. Never again would they allow the uncontrolled, anarchic forces of the free market to plunge the world into such chaos. The old faith was dead. A new one was needed. And that new faith had a prophet. His name was John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was a brilliant, charismatic, and profoundly influential British economist. He was the intellectual giant of his age. And he had provided a compelling diagnosis of the old system's sickness and a powerful prescription for the cure. In his masterpiece, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, published in 1936, he had systematically demolished the foundations of classical economics. The old theory had argued that the economy, if left alone, would always find its natural equilibrium at full employment. This, Keynes demonstrated, was a dangerous fantasy. He argued that capitalism, left to its own devices, was inherently unstable, prone to wild swings between boom and bust, and could get stuck for long periods in a state of high unemployment. The invisible hand was a myth. It was, he suggested, palsied. The solution, Keynes argued, was to replace the invisible hand with the visible, intelligent hand of the state. Governments, he taught, must take active responsibility for managing their national economies. During a downturn, when people were not spending and businesses were not investing, the government must step in to fill the gap. It should use its power to borrow and spend in public works, on infrastructure, on social programs to stimulate demand and create jobs. In good times, it should raise taxes and cut spending to prevent the economy from overheating and to pay down the debts incurred during the bust. This was a revolutionary idea. It was no longer a question of whether the government should intervene in the economy. The only question was how it should intervene. In the immediate post-war years, this Keynesian consensus became the unchallenged orthodoxy across the entire Western world. It was a broad church embraced by politicians of both the left and the right. In Britain, the new Labour government of Clement Attlee, elected in a landslide in 1945, embarked on a radical program of creating a comprehensive cradle-to-grave welfare state. They nationalized key industries: coal, railways, electricity, steel, and, most famously, created the National Health Service, providing free healthcare for all. Even the opposing Conservative Party largely accepted this new settlement. In the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, with its massive public works projects and the creation of Social Security, had already fundamentally transformed the role of the federal government. This new role was now accepted as a permanent feature of American life. And across continental Europe, post-war reconstruction, often funded by America's Marshall Plan, was guided by the principles of central planning, state investment, and the creation of robust social safety nets. This was the age of social democracy, of the mixed economy, of managed capitalism. For the vast, overwhelming majority of economists, politicians, intellectuals, and the general public, the great ideological debate of the 20th century was over. The old individualistic creed of laissez-faire capitalism was dead and buried, a relic of a cruel and disastrous past. The future, everyone seemed to agree, belonged to some form of collectivism, to the belief that the community, acting through the instrument of a powerful and benevolent state, had the right and the duty to guide economic life for the common good. The world that was the world of the 19th century was gone forever. A new world had been born. The intellectual victory of collectivism seemed total, its triumph absolute. Any defense of the old free-market liberalism was seen as not just eccentric but morally suspect, a nostalgic longing for a system that had produced poverty, fascism, and war. But in the quiet corners of academia, in the intellectual wilderness, a few lonely, dissenting voices refused to join the celebration. They looked at this new world, this new consensus, and they did not see a solution. They saw a new and even more terrible danger. They saw the beginnings of a new road, a road paved with good intentions, that led directly to a new kind of serfdom. And the most eloquent, the most passionate, and the most determined of these voices belonged to an Austrian economist living in London, a man who was about to begin a long, lonely, and seemingly hopeless war to turn back the tide of history. His name was Friedrich August von Hayek. In the great tide of post-war collectivism, a few men stood like rocks, refusing to be moved. They were the last believers in a dying faith, the keepers of a flame that the rest of the world believed had been extinguished forever. They were the remnants of the classical liberal tradition, and their intellectual prophet, the man who would articulate their fears and give voice to their lonely dissent, was an Austrian economist living in exile in London. His name was Friedrich August von Hayek. Hayek was a man shaped by the trauma of collapse. Born in Vienna in 1899, the intellectual capital of a dying empire, he had come of age in a world of chaos. He had fought in the First World War on the Italian front. He had witnessed the disintegration of the vast, multicultural Austro-Hungarian Empire. He had lived through the horrors of the post-war hyperinflation that had vaporized the savings of the German and Austrian middle classes. And he had watched, with growing dread, as economic chaos and political polarization gave birth to the monsters of fascism and communism. His intellectual training took place in the unique crucible of Red Vienna, a city governed by socialists but home to one of the world's most brilliant and fiercely anti-socialist schools of economic thought. Hayek became a devoted disciple of the great patriarch of the Austrian school, the formidable and uncompromising Ludwig von Mises. The Austrian school taught a radical form of free-market economics. They argued that a complex, modern economy was an organism, not a machine. It was a spontaneous order, a vast, intricate web of information and communication that was far too complex for any central planner to ever comprehend. The only mechanism that could possibly coordinate this complexity, they insisted, was the price system. Prices were not arbitrary numbers. They were signals, packets of information that communicated scarcity, demand, and opportunity to millions of individual actors simultaneously. From this followed their central, devastating critique of socialism. Any attempt by the state to plan an economy, to set prices and wages, would inevitably destroy this vital information system. The central planner, no matter how brilliant or well-intentioned, would be flying blind. Without the signals of the free market, they would have no way of knowing what to produce or how to allocate resources efficiently. State planning, Mises and Hayek argued, was not just inefficient. It was, in the long run, impossible. It would lead inevitably to economic chaos and poverty. In 1931, armed with these ideas, Hayek was invited to the London School of Economics. It was here that he would engage in one of the great intellectual duels of the 20th century, his long and fierce battle with John Maynard Keynes. For a time, the two men represented the two opposing poles of economic thought. Keynes arguing for government intervention to fight the Great Depression. Hayek arguing that the depression was itself caused by a prior artificial credit boom created by governments, and that the only cure was to let the system painfully but necessarily liquidate its bad investments. History, it seemed, had declared a clear winner. As governments around the world adopted Keynesian policies to fight the slump and to mobilize for war, Hayek's ideas were pushed to the margins. He became a figure of intellectual exile, a prophet whose warnings were ignored. The world had chosen Keynes. Hayek was left in the wilderness. But it was in this wilderness, as he watched Britain transform itself into a planned wartime economy, that Hayek began to formulate his most famous and powerful argument. He became convinced that the economic debate was about something far more important than business cycles. It was about the very future of human freedom. In 1944, at the very height of the war and the collectivist spirit, Hayek published his warning to the world. It was a short, passionate, and easily readable book, aimed not at his fellow economists, but at the general public. It was called The Road to Serfdom. The book's thesis was a thunderous, counterintuitive polemic. Hayek argued that the fascism of Nazi Germany, which Britain and America were fighting a world war to destroy, was not a capitalist reaction against socialism. It was, he insisted, a form of socialism. He argued that all forms of collectivism, whether they called themselves communism, fascism, or democratic socialism, shared a common root: the desire to replace the spontaneous order of the free market with the conscious direction of a central plan. And this, he warned, was the first fatal step on the road to tyranny. A central economic plan, he argued, cannot be democratic. A complex economy requires thousands of difficult decisions every day. A parliament cannot debate every price or every production quota. Inevitably, power must be delegated to a small group of experts, to a board of planners. These planners, in turn, in order to implement their grand vision, will find that they cannot allow the messy, unpredictable choices of individuals to get in their way. They must control not just production, but consumption. They must control not just what jobs are available, but who works them. To control economic life, you must ultimately control every aspect of life. The seemingly benign desire to create social justice or economic equality, Hayek warned, would inevitably require the state to treat different people differently, to favor one group over another. This would destroy the fundamental principle of liberalism, equality before a single universal law. And finally, to get the public to agree to the sacrifices and the coercion required by the plan, the state would need to create a powerful propaganda machine. It would need to demonize dissenters and create a single, overriding common good, to which every individual must be subordinate. The path, he argued, was a slippery slope. The well-intentioned welfare state would lead to the all-powerful planning state, which would lead, inexorably, to the totalitarian state where the individual has no rights, no freedom, and no value outside of their service to the collective. The road to serfdom, he declared, was paved with good intentions. The road to serfdom was a political bombshell. It became a surprise bestseller in both Britain and in America wary of post-war government control. An abridged version published in Reader's Digest brought its message to millions. It made Hayek a famous public intellectual. But among the intellectual and political elite, the book was almost universally condemned. He was accused of being a reactionary, a pessimist, a man who would sacrifice the well-being of the poor on the altar of a rigid, abstract theory. His comparison of British democratic socialism to German Nazism was seen as a monstrous and offensive smear. He was dismissed as a crank, an ideologue, a voice from a buried past. The experience crystallized Hayek's sense of profound intellectual isolation. He saw the world, with the best of intentions, rushing headlong down the very road he had warned against. He realized that writing a single book was not enough. The collectivists had been building their intellectual and political networks for decades. They controlled the universities, the journals, the political parties, the very climate of opinion. If the flame of liberty was to be kept alive, its few remaining defenders had to do the same. They had to find each other. They had to form a community, an intellectual arc, where the principles of the free society could be preserved, studied, and refined, waiting for the day when the collectivist tide would begin to recede. The prophet in the wilderness was about to send out a call, to gather the scattered remnants of his faith to a meeting on a high, quiet mountain. A prophet in the wilderness may have a powerful voice, but a single voice can be easily ignored. Friedrich Hayek, in the wake of the road to serfdom, understood this perfectly. He knew that if his ideas, the ideas of classical liberalism, were to survive the great intellectual winter of the post-war era, they needed more than just a single book. They needed a sanctuary, a place where the scattered and isolated defenders of the free society could gather, share their work, encourage each other, and forge a common strategy for the long, ideological war that lay ahead. He needed to build an ark, an intellectual ark to preserve the flame of liberty through the collectivist flood. With the help of a small grant from a Swiss foundation, Hayek began to organize. He meticulously drew up a list of individuals from around the world whom he considered to be the most brilliant and dedicated thinkers in the classical liberal tradition. He sent out personal invitations for a 10-day conference. The location he chose was symbolic. Not a bustling capital city like London or Paris, the centers of the new collectivist orthodoxy, but a place of neutrality, of quiet contemplation, high above the political turmoil of the continent. The location was the Hôtel du Parc, in the Swiss village of Mont Pelerin, a mountain overlooking the tranquil waters of Lake Geneva. In April of 1947, they came. A small, select group of 39 individuals from 10 different countries. To an outside observer, they would have looked like just another academic conference. But this was something more. This was a gathering of the intellectual resistance, the founding meeting of a society that would, in time, change the world. The cast of characters Hayek had assembled was extraordinary. It was a who's who of the thinkers who would become the godfathers of the movement later known as neoliberalism or market libertarianism. From his own Austrian tradition came the formidable patriarch Ludwig von Mises. Mises was the elder statesman of the group, a brilliant but famously intransigent and uncompromising thinker who had been Hayek's own mentor in Vienna. He was the one who had first argued, decades earlier, that rational economic calculation was impossible under socialism. From England, also in Austrian exile, came the great philosopher of science, Sir Karl Popper. Popper's monumental work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, was a devastating philosophical assault on the intellectual roots of totalitarianism, which he traced back to Plato, Hegel, and Marx. He argued for a society based on piecemeal social engineering, not grand utopian plans. From the United States came a contingent from the burgeoning Chicago School of Economics. Its leading light was a brilliant, charismatic, and ferociously intelligent young economist named Milton Friedman. Friedman, who would one day become the most famous and influential free market advocate in the world, was then just beginning his career. He brought a pragmatic, data-driven American approach that would sometimes clash with the more philosophical style of his European colleagues. There were others. The German economist Wilhelm Röpke, who would become a key architect of Germany's post-war economic miracle. The French philosopher Bertrand de Juvenal. The American journalist Henry Hazlitt, whose book Economics in One Lesson was a popular primer on free market ideas. This was not a collection of cranks. This was a gathering of immense intellectual firepower. For 10 days, this small band of intellectual outcasts engaged in intense, passionate, and often deeply contentious debate. This was not a meeting of like-minded disciples who all agreed. The society was, from its very inception, a broad church, united by a shared enemy but divided on many points of philosophy and strategy. There were fierce arguments between the Austrians like Hayek and Mises, who were deeply skeptical of any government intervention and believed in a more philosophical, deductive approach to economics, and the Chicago School economists like Friedman, who were more empirical, more focused on statistical analysis, and more willing to accept a limited role for government in areas like monetary policy. There was a fundamental split between those who were devout Christians and believed that a free market was the most moral system, and those who were agnostics or atheists and defended capitalism on purely utilitarian grounds. They argued about the proper role of the state, about the nature of democracy, about the moral foundations of a free society. The debates were so fierce that at one point, the famously stubborn Ludwig von Mises, disgusted by what he saw as the group's willingness to compromise on pure laissez-faire principles, stormed out of a session, shouting, "You're all a bunch of socialists." But despite these deep divisions, they were held together by a shared sense of crisis and a common purpose. They all agreed that the foundational values of Western civilization, individual liberty, private property, the rule of law, and free markets were under a mortal threat from the rising tide of collectivism. On the final day of the conference, they agreed to form a permanent international society. They debated what to call it. The Acton-Tocqueville Society was proposed, in honor of two great 19th-century liberal thinkers. But Hayek, wary of tying their group to any specific political label, suggested a more neutral and elegant name. They would name their society after the place where they first met, the mountain that had served as their sanctuary. They would be the Mont Pelerin Society. They drafted a statement of aims that would serve as their founding charter. The language was careful, scholarly, and deliberately non-confrontational. It stated that the central values of civilization are in danger. It lamented the decline of belief in private property and the competitive market, and the spread of creeds which, decrying the rights of the individual, are destructive of a free society. Their stated purpose was not to create a political party or to engage in propaganda. Their goal, they wrote, was more long-term. It was to facilitate an exchange of ideas among scholars, to analyze the causes and consequences of the decline of liberty, and to redefine the functions of the state in a way that was compatible with a free society. It was a modest academic mission statement. But behind this sober language lay a far more radical and ambitious strategy. Hayek and his colleagues were not just planning to talk to each other. They were planning a quiet, patient, and generational war to reclaim the soul of the modern world. They were playing the long game. The small band of scholars who descended from Mont Pelerin in 1947 were not naive idealists. They were seasoned veterans of intellectual warfare, and they knew they had lost the first great battle. The Keynesian consensus, the belief in a state-managed economy, was not just an academic theory. It was the dominant political and social reality of their time. It was an intellectual fortress, its walls built from the shared assumptions of politicians, civil servants, journalists, and university professors. A direct assault on this fortress would be futile. Friedrich Hayek and his colleagues understood that they could not change the world overnight. They needed a different strategy, a long-term strategy. They had to play the long game. Theirs would not be a war of political barricades, but a generational war of ideas. Hayek himself had laid out the blueprint for this war. He believed that history is ultimately shaped not by politicians or by popular opinion, but by a small number of intellectuals, the people he called the second-hand dealers in ideas. These are the teachers, the journalists, the writers, and the policy advisors who take the abstract theories of the philosophers and economists and translate them into the common sense of the next generation. The collectivist victory, he argued, had been achieved because for 50 years, their ideas had dominated the universities and the intellectual journals. To reverse the tide, his own side had to do the same. The Mont Pelerin Society, MPS, itself would be the general staff for this long war. It would be a new kind of secret society, an international invisible college for the free market. Its structure was carefully designed for this purpose. It was not a public organization. Its membership was, and remains, strictly by invitation only, a carefully curated list of the world's most prominent liberal and libertarian thinkers. Its meetings, held every year or two in different resort locations around the globe, were completely private. No press was admitted. No minutes were published. This veil of secrecy was not for any nefarious purpose, they argued, but to create a safe space. It allowed members to debate freely and frankly, to test out new and unpopular ideas, and to argue amongst themselves without the fear of public ridicule or political pressure. The MPS itself would not engage in any direct political lobbying or public propaganda. Its role was to be the intellectual dynamo, the greenhouse where the ideas of a free society could be protected from the hostile climate outside. Here, they could be nurtured, debated, refined, and made ready for the day when the political weather would finally change. But a greenhouse is not enough. You also need a way to plant the seeds in the wider world. And so, the members of the Mont Pelerin Society began the slow, patient, and well-funded work of building a global intellectual infrastructure. They created a vast international network of institutions designed to fight their war of ideas on every front. The first front was the universities. They knew they had to recapture the high ground of academic theory. Members of the society established powerful academic strongholds that would become world-renowned centers of free market thought. The most famous of these was the economics department at the University of Chicago. Here, MPS members Milton Friedman and George Stigler trained a new generation of fiercely pro-market economists, the Chicago Boys, whose influence would be felt around the globe. In Virginia, MPS members James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock founded the Public Choice School of Economics, which used economic theory to analyze the self-interested failures of government itself. These academic centers produced a steady stream of new research, new theories, and, most importantly, new disciples. The second, and perhaps most innovative front, was the creation of a new kind of institution, the think tank. Hayek and his colleagues realized that academic books and journal articles were not enough. They needed organizations that could take these complex theories and translate them into practical, accessible, and persuasive policy proposals that politicians and journalists could understand and use. One of the first and most influential of these was the Institute of Economic Affairs, IEA, in London, co-founded in 1955 by MPS member Anthony Fisher. Fisher, a successful businessman, had supposedly gone to Hayek after reading The Road to Serfdom and asked what he could do for the cause. Hayek advised him to shun direct politics and instead fund a war of ideas. The IEA became a relentless and highly effective critic of the British welfare state and the Keynesian consensus, publishing a constant stream of pamphlets, studies, and articles promoting free market solutions. In the United States, this model was replicated on a massive scale. MPS members were instrumental in the founding and guidance of what would become the most powerful conservative and libertarian think tanks in the world, including the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, and the American Enterprise Institute. This network of think tanks became the crucial bridge between abstract theory and practical politics. They were the transmission belt for the ideas nurtured within the Mont Pelerin Society. The third front was publishing and media. They needed to reach a wider audience. Wealthy backers and foundations, often with connections to the society, funded the creation of new journals and publishing houses dedicated to their cause. The University of Chicago Press became a major outlet for their academic work. Magazines like The Freeman and, later, Reason were founded to bring libertarian ideas to a popular audience. For 30 years, from the late 1940s to the early 1970s, this network grew quietly and patiently. To the outside world, it seemed like nothing was happening. The Keynesian consensus, the belief in big government and the mixed economy, seemed more powerful and more permanent than ever. The members of the Mont Pelerin Society and their small network of institutions were largely ignored, dismissed by the mainstream as irrelevant cranks, academic dinosaurs fighting a battle that history had already decided. They were voices crying in the wilderness. But they were not just crying. They were organizing. They were building. They were refining their arguments. They were training their cadres. They were waiting. They understood, as the Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci had argued from the opposite side of the political spectrum, that to achieve political power, you must first win the long, slow war of position for cultural and intellectual hegemony. They were playing the long game, and they were waiting for a crisis. They knew that in times of stability, people are unwilling to question their fundamental beliefs. But in a time of crisis, when the old certainties crumble and the dominant ideas fail, the world suddenly becomes open to radical alternatives. The patient work of the Mont Pelerin Society was an intellectual insurance policy, a complete, ready-made and radical new worldview, just waiting for the old world to break. And in the 1970s, it did. For 3 decades, the world that the Mont Pelerin Society opposed had seemed unshakably strong. The post-war Keynesian consensus, the belief in a state-managed mixed economy, had delivered unprecedented prosperity, low unemployment, and social stability. It was the golden age of capitalism, and the ideas of Hayek and Friedman seemed like relics, a chapter of history that had been definitively closed. But in the 1970s, the golden age came to a sudden, shuddering halt. The world's economic engine began to sputter and seize. The old certainties crumbled, and in the midst of this profound crisis, the intellectual warriors of the Mont Pelerin Society, who had been waiting patiently in the wilderness for a generation, saw their moment. The time for their revolution, a revolution they would call a counter-revolution, had finally arrived. The crisis of the 1970s was born from a monster that, according to the dominant economic theories of the day, was not supposed to exist. That monster was stagflation. The Keynesian model was built on a simple trade-off. A government could accept a little more inflation to get lower unemployment, or it could accept a little more unemployment to get lower inflation. What was not supposed to happen was for both to rise at the same time. But that is exactly what happened. Across the Western world, economic growth stalled. Unemployment began to climb, and at the same time, inflation, the rate at which prices rise, began to spin out of control. In Britain, inflation would peak at nearly 27%. In the United States, it hit double digits. People's savings were being eaten away. Their wages were worth less every month. The causes were complex. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979, when OPEC nations embargoed the West, sent the price of energy, the lifeblood of the industrial world, skyrocketing. Powerful trade unions demanded huge wage increases to keep up with rising prices, which in turn fueled even more inflation. And governments, trying to spend their way out of the problem as Keynes had taught them, simply printed more money, which only made the inflation worse. The Keynesian system, which had seemed so invincible, now appeared helpless. Its old tools no longer worked. The world's political and economic leaders were faced with a crisis they could not understand and could not solve. The intellectual fortress they had built was beginning to crumble. And as the old order faltered, a new, confident, and radical voice began to be heard. It was the voice of the Mont Pelerin Society. They had been waiting for this moment. They had spent 30 years developing a complete, coherent, and ready-made explanation for the crisis and a radical prescription for the cure. The diagnosis was offered most powerfully by their most charismatic public champion, Milton Friedman. Now a Nobel Prize-winning economist and a media star with his own popular television series, Free to Choose, Friedman relentlessly hammered home a single, simple message. The problem, he argued, was not that capitalism was failing. The problem was that there was not enough capitalism. The problem was government. Stagnation, he argued, was caused by decades of excessive government regulation that had stifled innovation, and by powerful trade unions that had protected inefficient industries and prevented the labor market from functioning properly. And inflation, he declared, was always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It was caused simply by governments printing too much money to pay for their bloated welfare states and to appease their political constituencies. This diagnosis was clear, simple, and for a world in crisis, increasingly compelling. And the cure they offered was just as clear and just as radical. It was a form of economic shock therapy. The neoliberal prescription, developed in the private meetings of the Mont Pelerin Society and promoted by its network of think tanks, consisted of four main pillars. First, privatization. The state, they argued, was inefficient and bureaucratic. All state-owned industries, the railways, the airlines, the telephone companies, the utilities should be sold off to the private sector, where the profit motive would force them to become more efficient. Second, deregulation. The complex web of government regulations that governed everything from banking to environmental standards should be torn down. These rules, they claimed, suffocated enterprise and prevented the market from working its magic. Third, slashing public spending. The welfare state, while well-intentioned, had become a bloated and unaffordable drag on the economy. Governments needed to make deep cuts to social programs to balance their budgets and reduce the tax burden on productive individuals and corporations. And fourth, crushing organized labor. The power of the trade unions had to be broken. They were, in the neoliberal view, a cartel that artificially inflated wages, protected lazy workers, and resisted the necessary and painful changes that a dynamic economy required. This was the shock doctrine. It was a program that promised short-term pain for long-term gain. It was a declaration of war on the entire post-war consensus. For decades, these ideas had been considered extreme, cruel, and politically impossible. But in the chaos and despair of the 1970s, they suddenly began to sound like the only coherent alternative. The impossible was beginning to seem inevitable. All that was needed was a political leader with the courage or the ruthlessness to implement it. The first great real-world laboratory for this shock therapy was not in a Western democracy, but in a place where it could be implemented by force, without the inconvenience of democratic consent. That place was Chile. In 1973, a brutal military coup, backed by the CIA, overthrew the democratically elected socialist government of President Salvador Allende. The new dictator, General Augusto Pinochet, had no coherent economic plan, but a group of Chilean economists who had been trained by Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago did. These Chicago boys, many of whom had connections to the Mont Pelerin Society, presented Pinochet with their radical free market blueprint. Under the protection of Pinochet's military regime, with its torture chambers and its death squads, the Chicago boys implemented the full shock doctrine. They privatized hundreds of state-owned companies. They slashed tariffs and government spending. They deregulated the economy. While the experiment was praised by figures like Hayek and Friedman for eventually taming inflation and unleashing economic growth, it was achieved at a horrific human cost, creating massive unemployment and inequality. The Chilean experiment was a brutal but effective demonstration. It showed that the ideas nurtured on Mont Pelerin could be put into practice. The doctrine had been tested in the laboratory of a dictatorship. Now it was ready to be brought home to the great democracies of the West. The intellectual counter-revolution was about to become a political one. The first and most ideologically driven of these champions came to power in the United Kingdom. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister. She was a new kind of conservative leader. She was not a traditional one-nation Tory, committed to the post-war consensus. She was a conviction politician, a true believer, and her conviction had been forged by the thinkers of the Mont Pelerin Society. Thatcher was a fervent disciple of Friedrich Hayek. She saw him as her intellectual mentor. She famously kept a copy of The Road to Serfdom in her handbag, and would reportedly slam it down on tables during policy meetings, declaring, "This is what we believe." Her inner circle was saturated with the influence of the network Hayek had built. Her closest intellectual ally and the architect of her early policies, Sir Keith Joseph, was a member of the Mont Pelerin Society. He had founded his own influential think tank, the Center for Policy Studies, to translate these free market ideas into a concrete political program. The Institute of Economic Affairs, the think tank co-founded by MPS member Anthony Fisher, provided a steady stream of the radical policies that would become the hallmarks of her government. When Thatcher came to power, she did not seek to manage the Keynesian welfare state. She sought to dismantle it. Her government was not an administration. It was a revolution, and it would follow the shock therapy blueprint with unwavering and often brutal determination. The Thatcherite Revolution was a systematic implementation of the Mont Pelerin agenda. The great state-owned industries, once considered the commanding heights of the British economy, were sold off to the private sector. British Telecom, British Airways, British Steel, British Gas, the water authorities all were privatized, creating a new class of shareholders and fundamentally altering the relationship between the citizen and the state. The immense power of Britain's trade unions, which she saw as the primary cause of the nation's economic decline, was deliberately and systematically broken. The defining confrontation came with the Great Miners' Strike of 1984–85. For nearly a year, the government waged a bitter war of attrition against the National Union of Mine Workers, one of the most powerful unions in the world. In the end, Thatcher crushed them. It was a victory that broke the back of the British labor movement for a generation. And she unleashed the power of finance. The Big Bang of 1986 radically deregulated the financial markets of the City of London, sweeping away old restrictions and turning London into the hyper-competitive, global financial hub it is today. It was a painful and divisive transformation. It created immense social upheaval, mass unemployment in the old industrial heartlands, and a sharp rise in inequality. But it was a revolution that she pursued with an almost religious conviction. She was, in her own words, rolling back the frontiers of the state, and her inspiration had come directly from the intellectual network born on a Swiss mountain. A year later, in 1980, the revolution found its second great champion. Ronald Reagan was elected president of the United States. Where Thatcher was ideological and combative, Reagan was optimistic and charming. But the underlying philosophy was the same. Reagan was a disciple not of Hayek's complex philosophy, but of Milton Friedman's simple, powerful, and televised free market message. Government is not the solution to our problem, he declared in his first inaugural address. Government is the problem. His administration was a roll call of the American branch of the Mont Pelerin network. Dozens of members of the society, or individuals closely affiliated with its network of think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute, were appointed to key positions in his administration. The ideas that had been developed in academic obscurity were now being implemented from within the White House itself. The Reaganomics program followed the same script. There were massive tax cuts, particularly for corporations and the wealthy, based on the theory that this would stimulate investment. There was a sweeping program of deregulation, targeting everything from environmental protection to workplace safety. And there was a direct, symbolic confrontation with organized labor. In 1981, when the Air Traffic Controllers Union went on strike, Reagan fired all of them, breaking the union and sending a clear message to the American labor movement. The Reagan-Thatcher revolution of the 1980s was the great political triumph of the Mont Pelerin Society. The ideas that had seemed so extreme and so marginal just a decade earlier were now the governing ideology of the two most powerful nations on Earth. Their influence spread globally. International institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund began to impose similar structural adjustment programs, policies of privatization, deregulation, and austerity in developing nations as a condition for receiving loans. The final, spectacular victory seemed to come in 1989. The fall of the Berlin Wall, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, was hailed as the definitive end of the great ideological struggle of the 20th century. The collectivist experiment was over, a dead end of history. A new global consensus was declared. The future, it was said, belonged to one system and one system only: liberal, democratic, free market capitalism. It was, as one famous political scientist called it, the end of history. Friedrich Hayek, the prophet who had been cast into the wilderness, had lived long enough to see his ideas conquer the world. The long game, the patient 30-year war of ideas, had been won. The architects who had met on the mountain had successfully redrawn the blueprint of the world. For its defenders, for the intellectual heirs of Hayek and Friedman, the legacy of the Mont Pelerin Society is a story of unprecedented human liberation and prosperity. They argue that the free market revolution was the essential force that defeated the great totalitarian threat of the 20th century. By exposing the economic and moral bankruptcy of central planning, they helped to bring about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the liberation of hundreds of millions of people from communist tyranny. They argue that the subsequent wave of globalization, free trade, and market liberalization has lifted billions of people out of extreme poverty, particularly in countries like China and India, creating the greatest and fastest reduction in human misery in the history of the world. They point to the explosion of innovation and technological progress that has occurred in the era of deregulation and global competition. The personal computer, the internet, the smartphone, all, they would argue, are products of the dynamic entrepreneurial culture that their ideas unleashed. They believe they replaced a world of stagnant, state-controlled, and conformist societies with a world of individual choice, dynamism, and boundless opportunity. In this telling, the members of the Mont Pelerin Society are intellectual heroes who saved Western civilization from the dead end of collectivism and ushered in a new age of global prosperity. But there is another, much darker view of their legacy. For a growing number of critics, the triumph of the Mont Pelerin Society is not a story of universal progress, but of a vast transfer of wealth and power from the public to a private, corporate elite. They argue that the neoliberal revolution has created a world of staggering and socially corrosive inequality. The tax cuts for the wealthy and the assault on organized labor, they contend, have led to 4 decades of stagnant wages for ordinary workers, while the incomes of the top 1% have soared into the stratosphere. They argue that the deregulation of the financial sector, a core tenet of the MPS agenda, led directly to the reckless speculation and systemic risk that caused the global financial crisis of 2008, a crisis whose costs were borne not by the bankers who caused it, but by ordinary taxpayers through massive bailouts. They point to the privatization of essential public services like healthcare, education, and what era's a move that has often replaced public accountability with the cold logic of the profit motive, turning basic human rights into commodities. And they argue that the society's deep-seated hostility to government regulation has made it impossible to collectively address existential threats like climate change, which are a direct consequence of an economic model based on perpetual, unchecked growth and consumption. In this telling, the members of the Mont Pelerin Society were not disinterested scholars. They were the architects of a powerful ideological project, funded by corporations and wealthy patrons, designed to roll back the democratic gains of the 20th century and restore the power of a new, global elite. They were not saviors. They were the authors of a new road to serfdom. So what are we to make of this secret society of intellectuals? The story of the Mont Pelerin Society is not a simple conspiracy theory. There was no single, smoke-filled room where a cabal plotted to take over the world. The process was more subtle, more patient, and in many ways more profound. It is a story about the immense and often underestimated power of ideas. It demonstrates how a small group of determined, well-organized, and well-funded individuals, armed with a coherent and powerful set of beliefs, can, over the course of a generation, fundamentally shift the entire intellectual and political landscape. They were not a secret society in the mold of the Freemasons or the Rosicrucians. Their secret was not a mystical symbol or a blood oath. Their secret was their strategy. The understanding that the most effective way to change the world is not to win an election, but to win the battle for the intellectual common sense of the age. They knew that if you can change the ideas that universities teach, that journalists write, and that politicians think with, then policy and political change will inevitably follow. They were a revolutionary brotherhood, a quiet, intellectual conspiracy that succeeded beyond its founders' wildest dreams. Whether you see them as heroes or villains, as liberators or architects of a new inequality, their impact is undeniable. For better and for worse, they were the secret architects of our time. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of one of the most influential and least known societies of the modern era. The story of the Mont Pelerin Society is a powerful reminder that history is shaped not just by armies and elections, but by the quiet, persistent power of ideas. What are your thoughts on their legacy? Were they heroes who saved liberty, or the architects of our current crises? Let us know your theories in the comments below. If you enjoy these deep dives into the hidden currents that shape our world, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Driftwood Histories for more tales found adrift in time. We are grateful for your support. Until next time, stay curious.